TikTok Incorporated is a U.S. company speaking in the United States. The Act requires it to go dark. Whether you call that a ban or a divestiture, one thing is clear. It's a burden on TikTok's speech, so the First Amendment applies. Second, the Act is content-based from beginning to end. It applies only to social media platforms that have user-generated content except for business, product, and travel reviews. Within that content-based universe, it singles out a single speaker for uniquely harsh treatment, and it does so because the government fears that China could, in the future, indirectly pressure TikTok to disseminate foreign misinformation and propaganda. Finally, the Act can't satisfy any standard of scrutiny. The government has no valid interest in preventing foreign propaganda, and its fallback that it seeks merely to prevent covertness makes no sense, since that could be addressed with a risk disclosure. The government's real target, rather, is the speech itself. Its fear that Americans, even if fully informed, could be persuaded by Chinese misinformation. That, however, is a decision that the First Amendment leaves to the people. Given that, the government's data security rationale cannot independently sustain the Act. It is also grossly under-inclusive and ignores the most obvious, less restrictive alternative, simply banning TikTok Incorporated from sharing any sensitive user data with anyone. In short, this Act should not stand. At a minimum, you should preliminarily enjoin it, which will allow you to carefully consider this momentous issue and, for the reasons explained by the President-elect, potentially moot the case. I welcome your questions.
Exactly what is TikTok's speech here?
TikTok, Your Honor, uses an algorithm that, in its view, reflects the best mix of content. What the Act does is it says TikTok cannot do that unless ByteDance executes a qualified divestiture. That's a direct burden on TikTok speech, much less of a burden than the one that this Court struck down in the Simon & Schuster case, where all the author had to do was take a certain amount of proceeds and put it into an escrow account for a short period of time to satisfy a civil judgment.
So why does a restriction on ByteDance, which is not a citizen, is not located in the U.S., a restriction on TikTok?
Because what the law says to TikTok is that TikTok, you cannot use the algorithm that you prefer to use unless ByteDance executes a qualified divestiture. So the law, therefore, falls directly on TikTok itself. It imposes a burden on TikTok speech, again, a much more significant burden than the one that was struck down in Simon & Schuster.
So you're converting the restriction on ByteDance's ownership of the algorithm and the company into a restriction on TikTok's speech. So why can't we simply look at it as a restriction on ByteDance?
Because I think the burden falls directly on TikTok, and I can use a hypothetical that helps illustrate the point. Suppose that China used its leverage over Jeff Bezos' international empire, including his Chinese businesses, to force the Washington Post to write whatever China wanted on the front page of the Post. Surely the government couldn't come in and say, Jeff Bezos, you need to either sell the Washington Post or shut it down. That wouldn't just violate Mr. Bezos' First Amendment rights. That would also violate the Washington Post's First Amendment rights, because they are ultimately the one that's suffering the burden under that law, because they have to go dark and close up their books.
Counsel, you began by saying this is a U.S. company operating in the United States.
Yes, Your Honor.
But the ultimate company that controls it, ByteDance, was found by Congress, and I quote this, to be subject to Chinese laws that require it to assist or cooperate with the Chinese government's intelligence work, quote, and to ensure that the Chinese government has the power to access and control private data that the company holds. So are we supposed to ignore the fact that the ultimate parent is in fact subject to doing intelligence work for the Chinese government?
Well, Your Honor, I don't think you are supposed to ignore that at all, but I also don't think that it changes the analysis for a couple of reasons. Look, TikTok and...
Well, just hold a second. Well, as I said, you began by saying this is a U.S. company operating in the United States, and it seems to me that you're ignoring the major concern here of Congress, which was Chinese manipulation of the content and acquisition and harvesting of the content.
Sure. And I'll start by saying that TikTok Incorporated is a United States subsidiary operating in the United States with its own set of free speech rights.
Do you dispute the fact that ByteDance has ultimate control of TikTok in its corporate organization?
Yes, Your Honor, I do dispute that, but I also don't think that it matters, because even if China could exercise overwhelming power against TikTok versus ByteDance, I don't think it would change the analysis. And I can take that Washington Post hypothetical and ratchet it up a little bit to help illustrate the point. Let's suppose that the Chinese government had actually taken the Bezos children hostage, and it was using that leverage in order to force Bezos and the Washington Post to publish whatever they wanted on the front page of the Post. So China effectively has total control. I still don't think that Congress could come in and tell Bezos either sell the Post or shut it down, because that would violate Bezos's rights and the Washington Post rights. Maybe what they could do is come in and say, you need to disclose the fact that you're under this amount of coercion, so that the people who are looking at the paper understand it and can make their own assessment. But I think the First Amendment rights of both Bezos and the Post would be directly implicated, notwithstanding that China in that scenario has effectively total control over what gets printed in the Washington Post.
Counsel, let me break this down. I understand your argument that there is a First Amendment right that the U.S. company has. I'll go that far with you, okay?
I'll take it.
Because we're affecting their ability to talk in whatever way they choose. The Washington Post could choose without any influence or threat against the children of Mr. Bezos to promote Chinese policy, and our First Amendment would permit them to do that if they chose it independently, correct?
Yes.
Now the question becomes, so it's not, that's just a given that they have a First Amendment right. The next question is, assuming they do, what's the level of scrutiny we apply? Isn't that what the issue here is?
That is certainly one of the issues, Your Honor.